Good morning. Before Rob wanted me to give you this basket.
Tall for me. I can't. Yeah.
Good morning to the Wolfords. Good morning.
What happened to your friend from Mary Magdalene?
I don't know. I think the church worked.
I've been meaning to bring in a sketch, and I will bring it in next week, of the Flower City conspiracy trial.
Yes.
And I'm cross-examining none other than Dan Berrigan.
Oh,
I know you identified him as one of a prophet. I don't agree with that assessment. That's what makes the world go around. But I talked to a lot of folks, my contemporaries. Tom Mooney, who was at Lemoyne, he was taught by Berrigan. They couldn't stand him. He was so arrogant, pontificating. He wouldn't accept anyone else's opinion other than him. And I think he influenced those guys that ransacked the federal building, and inspired them to do it. So he was a prophet in maybe the wrong ways, but it was just kind of fun. And I'll bring the sketch in.
bring it in. I love it.
You know how many years ago? 53 years ago, that trial started on November 16th and finished right around Thanksgiving. So it was a long time ago.
It was, yes, indeed. Are we ready? And I've got somebody who's going to do the mic, or you do, yeah. Hi, Susie Q. Not bad for an old lady. You got it. Are you balance off?
Oh, no, I'm just always up.
It's the story of my life.
How are you?
Not bad.
Really?
Yeah, not bad.
Wouldn't help to complain about it anyway.
No, it wouldn't. Okay.
All right, I'll go sit down. Looks like you're ready to go.
I think so.
All right.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. If you heard some folks say they had a little difficulty getting into the presentation online last week, it was because we had some difficulty with the internet, and you can see it. So for all people my sisters who are watching and anybody else watching, if you missed last week, you can get in and see it. We had a little difficulty. Part of it was being in the chapel. So now we're here, and whoopee. Today our topic I don't know if it was good to give him the microphone.
I should announce the fact.
Listen.
Birthday tomorrow.
Yeah. Happy birthday, Liz. Listen. Yes, and now the whole world is listening. And Michael, if this fella in front gives trouble, hit him with your cane. You're welcome. Well, this morning, for our third week, we are going to take a look at the infancy narratives of Matthew, of Luke, and I think John, but we'll get to John before you go home. So I would like to read the first reading you'll hear this weekend from our new friend Isaiah. And it is Isaiah 61. So as my friend Michael would say, it's third Isaiah. They're home from exile. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. God has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, and proclaim liberty to captives and release to the prisoners, to announce a year of favor from the Lord and a day of vindication by our God. I rejoice heartily in the Lord. In my God is the joy of my soul. For God has clothed me with the robe of salvation, wrapped me in a mantle of justice, like a bridegroom adorned with a diadem, like a bride bedecked with her jewels. As the earth brings forth its plants and a garden makes its growth spring up, so will the Lord God make justice and praise spring up before all the nations. What did you hear? Besides my low voice. Pardon me, dear? Jubilation. jubilation. They're home from exile. Rejoice. They call this the third Sunday, Gaudete Sunday, rejoice in the Lord. So you see the pink candle. But the other powerful thing in that reading might have sounded familiar to you. Because when Jesus launched his public ministry in his hometown, they gave him the scriptures to read, and they were from Isaiah. Good morning. And he proclaimed to the whole synagogue, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring glad news to the poor." Who was he quoting? Isaiah. And remember, he closed the Bible, or the script, the Hebrew script, and he said, "Today, this proclamation is fulfilled." Now, there's a statement. And remember what happened to him after he did that. They took him out to a hill and a mountain and tried to kill him. So you see, the church looked back and saw Isaiah pointing to Jesus. Okay, so he's our new best friend, Isaiah. You sense the struggles that Jesus was going to face, and there's such power in this text. Think of what it was like to come back from exile. Think what it must be like for the people in Gaza to at least have a home. Think what it must be like for the Jewish settlements that were burned and people killed. So there is a powerful message in this reading. I want to share with you, before we begin a discussion of the scriptures, I want to tell you that when I was 7 years old, when Michael Wolford was 7 years old, he met me. I was in high school with his sister Ann at Mercy, and it seemed to me that they lived in East Ohio when we went to their home. Where was it, Michael? Gates. Well, a city dweller going to Gates was like going to the moon. So we got there, and I think I was 13 or 14. And Michael has some awful things to say about me. We won't make him repeat. But now he knows me when I'm 90. And he has met a different person in many ways. Would you say, Mike? Yes. Okay, that. Different than you were at 14. But when you frightened me, I threatened him at 14 with my black hair. So for the people online, he is accusing me of child abuse. That I got on the floor and rolled my black hair at him and tried to scare him. But we have old memories. I remember coming to your home. I remember raging through the lots and jumping over wire fences, and I still have a scar on this leg from it. I have memories of my mother and father. But my dear sister, God rest her, who was almost 4 years older than I, has her memories as well. And they're different. So my question to you, which ones are true? As everybody says, all of them are true. They are really all true, coming from our context and from our experience and from our relationships. And I think it is important that we look at Scripture the same way, that we understand the context in which it was written, the time they represent, and they wrote for the needs of the community they were serving. Now, if Matthew, Luke, and John took Amtrak or flied into Rochester and took Uber out here to Mendon to visit us, they would be exceptionally welcomed. But if they walked in the doors of St. Catherine's and saw the crib set behind you and all the beautiful ones on the left and the lovely one that was in chapel that was Bob Gruber's sister's, but as they got closer, they'd have questions. They might say to me, Matthew might say to me, Sister Barb, I wrote a gospel and I spoke about the Magi, but I didn't do anything with the shepherds. And Luke would burst in and say, I focused on the shepherds, you did the Magi. And Mary, they would hardly understand the scene, because what we have done is we have affirmed the truth of all of them and brought them together in one collage. Now, all of them were true to a degree, and it was what their community needed to hear. But they would be sort of stunned if they looked at the crib today, because it's not what they wrote about, each one of them. Now, that's why I want you to know that what Michael might say about me is not true. It's not true. Is that point clear? Yeah. They would say, God, that's a gorgeous thing. Who are those fellows with crowns off to the right? Luke would say. Matthew and Luke, who also wrote the Acts of the Apostles, wrote sometime between the 80s and the 90s. Now think about that. Michael knew me when he was 7. Now that he's 32, a few years have lapsed. We are now, with Matthew and Luke, out 40 to 50 years from the resurrection. Do you think that makes a difference? Would you grab this nice man, Mr. Portland? Why do you think it makes a difference, Rich?
Well, I think as time goes on, people remember certain things, and that's the way it is. And someone else says, well, I remember it somewhat differently, and I say, I don't remember what you're talking about.
That's right. And also, the community to whom they are writing has already accepted the resurrection. And the community has begun to grow, persecuted to be sure. But now, 50 years after the resurrection, I think people begin to say, well, we accept the resurrection. Like, yeah, I'd like to marry you, but could you tell me something about your family? Where are you from? How many siblings do you have? So there was inquiry about, well, where was he really born? Who were his parents? Did he have any siblings? And so we find the later Gospels begin to answer some of those questions. Also, when you think about the early church and what they were facing, it was very different. Although we always say the cross was right behind the crib in the creche. But they were facing real struggles. They were being asked to embrace Gentiles. Well, that's not very different from what we're being asked to do today. And people are resisting. We're being asked to accept different cultures, different understandings of human sexuality, different understandings about our environment. We're being asked to stretch ourselves, and so was the early church. Now, when you come to John, He was writing between the 90s and in the first century, at the end of the first century, 70 years after the resurrection. Several generations. It's like what your parents, Sue and Rich, taught you about the faith, but several generations later, what you taught your kids and what they're going to teach theirs. John was writing to a community that already believed, and he was trying to strengthen their faith. Now, Mike and I see our family and our history differently when he was 7 and I was 13 or 14. And that's life. My mother's death is now 63 years out from the actual event. And like John, with all the time in between, I now reflect and see meaning in her life and her experiences I didn't see before. And that is one of the great advantages of aging. One of the few, he said, one of the few advantages. Listen to the people online. If you saw this crowd, you'd know what I have to put up with. I've told you before about an absolute wonderful Jewish woman, a professor at Vanderbilt named Amy Jill Levine. And Amy Jill Levine has written all kinds of books about the misunderstood Jew, about Jesus. And she teaches New Testament. Now, I know that sounds like a contradiction, but she teaches New Testament, a conservative Jewish woman. She has written a book called Light of the World, A Beginner's Guide to Advent. Now, just the title alone and the author makes you say, really? So early on in the book, she says this: the nativity accounts had to fulfill two functions. On the one hand, they had to enlighten people, and they also had to entice people to draw them more deeply into the chapters that were following. The evangelists were writing primarily to insiders who wanted to know more. When we recognize the historical background and the literary art, we can see how brilliantly the evangelists, in quite different ways, accomplished their goals. As with any text, if we get the history wrong, we will also miss the allusions to other texts as well, and we will risk misunderstanding the gospel messages. A very interesting book. A woman who, some of her students say to her, well, why don't you become a Christian? She said, because I love being a Jew. But I appreciate the Christian faith, and it makes me a better Jew. So I think you would be very interested in listening to her. Any questions so far before we dig into each of these evangelists? Liz, got a question? No. What are you doing for your birthday?
Watching the Bills beat the Cowboys.
Oh, she's going to watch the Bills beat the Cowboys. All right. Home here. Oh, very good.
I didn't mention, I was supposed to be at the game. My brother had gotten me a ticket.
John had gotten you tickets. Now, just a moment. Who sold them, John? John, after all these lectures. Okay, you got a nice, I'll give you a little drambuie if you need it. All right, now, Matthew always appears first in the New Testament, probably because it's the longest, but it's certainly not the first. Matthew uses Mark and other oral stories, and his audience was primarily Jewish. Sometimes people call this the Jewish gospel. He was writing primarily to Jews who loved their Jewish faith, but they were being drawn into this Christian message. So he has a Jewish Christian outlook, because that was the outlook of the community for whom he presented his work. His first 4 chapters cover the genealogy of Jesus, a real desire to show his links back to David, his birth, the wise men, the flight into Egypt, Herod's anger at the wise men and the death of the children, their return, John the Baptist, and the launching of his ministry and Jesus' childhood. There is a huge use of Isaiah in Matthew, in that chart we gave out the first week. Isaiah sees Christ as a fulfillment. Okay. We see the 3 kings and their retinue off in the distance. They were Gentiles. And Matthew focuses on Joseph, betrothed to a pregnant girl. The angel speaks to him, and he is responsible so often for the child's safety. Joseph fades from view, except Jesus in his ministry is named Son of Joseph. So Matthew was speaking to a divided community, just as we today are either preaching to or living next to or entertaining members of a divided community. Like the ancient Gentiles, soon they were accepted into the faith. And I believe many of the struggles we're having now will soon work their way out, and Christians will accept them more readily. Did you see, this was a surprise to me when the Pope said single mothers can receive communion. I always thought they could. But doesn't that say something about what some dioceses have been doing? Francis, I think, would do much more if he could. I think his main desire is to hold the Roman Church together. And when you think about the diversity within the Roman Church, from Africa to Asia to North America, South America, he's got a huge job. So, how do you think today the church should speak to a divided nation the way Matthew was speaking to his community? What should we do? There's one for you, John. Susie Q.
Sometimes we try to stretch ourselves too thin to meet the needs of everybody. And I think sometimes we bend over backwards to do that. Let's pull everybody together instead of preaching to each group separately. That's kind of how I look at it.
Okay. So you're saying that our preaching and teaching needs to be along the line of unity, and then how we as individuals act. But we can't do the whole thing. It's in our individual world how we make a difference. Should we give her an A? Yeah, give her. Jesus' message, if we really look at it carefully, is asking us to love those with whom we differ. And I'm telling you, it's hard. It's very hard. But he's asking us to not to change our point of view per se, but to be accepting of the other. I think that can make a huge difference. Now, when we move from Matthew to Luke, we find that Luke was focusing on the Gentiles. So you see, their context is very different. And they chose stories that were going to reach and grab their attention from their audience. In Luke's account, Mary is the key in the infancy narratives. In Matthew, it's Joseph. I remember preaching in Macedon, and I had said to Rob before Mass, I'm going to focus today on, we're doing Luke, and Mary is, no, it was the other way around. It's Matthew, and Joseph is the one. So he gets up and reads the gospel, and I thought, oh, sweet Mary and Joseph. He read Luke instead of Matthew. So I stepped up in the pulpit, and he looked at me and said, I am so sorry. So I scrambled, and we made it. But Luke's gospel starts with the census, the annunciation of John and of Jesus, the visitation, the presentation, the circumcision, the role of John, the genealogy, like Matthew, but they're in different order, the birth, the shepherds, the childhood in Nazareth. He used Mark just like Matthew did, written about the same time. In fact, one scholar says Luke used 60% of Mark's gospel, written in Syria. And what Luke was trying to say is that God is faithful to the chosen people, but is open to others. Two very different contexts that we see represented in the creches done in different cultures. I think today, perhaps the biggest question for us as Christians is, how open are we to people who are different? I started to read that book I told you about last week, The Power and the Glory, about what has happened to the evangelical church. And it is stunning to read how politics, in many ways, captured the Christian message. So now when we come to John, and John isn't present in the creche, at least physically, written around the end of the 1st century. Think about that now. The martyrdoms, the persecutions, the spread of the church. He is writing to house churches. He's writing to a believing community like you and me. And he's saying, yes, Jesus is the Son of God, and some believe he was writing in Ephesus. There are many different theories about which John wrote. I'm not sure if we know for sure, but John's gospel is the most reflective and theological of all the gospels. He uses signs and symbols. I don't know if you remember last Lent when we talked about John, we said the first part of the book dealt with signs. And unless you knew what he was doing, you'd miss the point. He starts out with the wedding feast of Cana. Mary is center, a Jewish event. Bride, groom, parties, wine, celebration of the Jewish faith. But then a religious leader comes to him at night, Nicodemus, and said, you know, are you the one really? I'm not sure, but it's all at night. And what John is saying, we are now beginning to move in a direction that some Jews are going to be attracted. And then he tells the story of meeting the Samaritan at the well. We're moving again to open our arms to non-Jews. And then he tells the story of the blind man whose parents would not say that Jesus cured the man because they'd be thrown out of the temple. So then we're hearing the arms are spreading wider and a conflict is beginning to happen. But there's no infancy narrative in John. No Bethlehem, no Mary and Joseph, no shepherds, no magi. But I would like to say there is. So, putting on my cheaters, let me share with you the first chapter of John and tell me what you hear after I read it. Chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. In the beginning was the Word. Who is the Word? Jesus, the Word made flesh. It's God, you know, but it's the Word made flesh, the incarnation that we're going to celebrate in a couple weeks, is the birth of a child who takes on human flesh. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's saying in symbolic words that the incarnation brought humanity to earth in the form of Jesus. Humanity, divinity took on humanity. Then he goes on to say, there was a man sent from God whose name was John, right here in the first chapter. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light, the true light which enlightens everyone coming into the world. Rich, have you got that, Susie?
When you first read that, of course, it used to be read at every Mass,
Yes, at the end of the Mass.
at the end of the Mass.
Don't give our age away here, kid.
Pre-Vatican II.
Yeah.
But in the beginning was the Word, and I interpreted that as God. And then it was said the light. I thought the light was Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
So I made that distinction, but evidently
You can make that distinction, that's just fine. The Word throughout John is the Word of God, which is Jesus.
Okay.
Now, the Scriptures we also call the Word of God, inspired by the Holy Spirit. But the thing I'd like you to listen to after I did this, I'm going back to the very opening of the Old Testament. Chapter 1, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the water, and God said, "Let there be light." So we have the 6 days of creation. My theory is that John is dipping back into the book of Genesis for his opening. In the beginning was the Word. And as he goes on, he talks about John the Baptist. And then the author says about Jesus, he was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, but the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. That is a symbolic creation story. And for those of us old enough, at the end of every Mass, it was proclaimed in Latin, which I didn't understand. But it's absolutely an exquisite piece of literature. So when we look at the crib, and we see Mary and Joseph featured, the shepherds, the wise men, all of them are there. It's like all the stories are put together. And then John tops it off by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Does that give you any different insight into the narratives? As Sue said, it makes them certainly more human. And that's one of the points I was going to make. The question is, as they are different, does that weaken our faith? I don't think so. It's like Michael's knowledge of me then and now, both true, but so much has happened in between. Sue, Rich, would you give her the mic? Thanks, honey.
It's like going back to what we started with. Different opinions put together to make our story.
Say that again, the first part, I didn't catch.
Well, when we were starting today,
Yeah.
we talked about point of view and how each of you has a different point of view in a situation.
Yeah.
Well, that's the same thing we're talking about here. Different ideas coming together to reinforce what we believe about our faith.
Beautiful. Different points of view, different oral stories coming to view, trying deeply to tell the story so that this community, which is Jewish, and this community that is Gentile, will see it's for all of them.
And nobody's wrong.
A star on your forehead. Nobody is wrong. Isn't that interesting? So, for us as Christians, we have deep faith that Jesus became one of us. But that doesn't really give us the right to say the Sikhs aren't authentic, or the Hindus aren't authentic, or the Greek Orthodox are Christian, or that the Muslims are not authentic. Each one understands God in a slightly different way. And we are fortunate to believe that God became one of us. That's a huge difference. Took on our flesh. But it calls for profound respect. You know, when people show up at synagogues with guns, you've got to say, really? Why? It's scary. When we look at the crib, I'm hoping that we'll see several things that can relate to our present experience. When we look at the crib, at least according to Luke and Matthew, this family was not wealthy. This family was impoverished. This family was obeying Roman law, according to one gospel writer, by going for the census. This family, according to one, couldn't find a place to stay. Think of the people today that have no place to go. There's an ad on television about Covenant House. I don't know if you remember that, in New York City, that takes in homeless kids. I can't imagine what it is to sleep on the street. And the migrants. The other thing, when we look at the crib, we see a celebration of diversity. We see shepherds who were not very respected, but necessary. And we see these well-to-do types of royalty coming from the East. And they're all there. So the diversity, we see outsiders welcomed. And we see painful decisions that had to be made around the birth of this child. According to Matthew, when the wise folks took a different route home, Herod, known for his brutality, went after small children. Can you imagine what the parents in Israel and Gaza felt when they saw their children killed? Innocent little ones. It just breaks your heart. And some authors have said, when we look at the creche, it's beautiful. The stars, the gifts, the angels, it's wonderful. But right from the very beginning, the cross is present. And it unfolds in Egypt, the flight to Egypt, the revenge that Herod seeks. And for people of faith, the cross is sometimes a companion for us because we're just human beings. The other thing that speaks to diversity for me is the fact that every culture has its own creche. If you look at the ones that Rob has displayed, they're from all over the world. Christians all over the world see Jesus through their own lens. And isn't that wonderful? Asians, Africans, and he isn't that little blue-eyed blonde sweetheart. He's not a little white Anglo-Saxon child. The Word became flesh, not just white Anglo-Saxon flesh, not just male flesh, but all of us are made in God's image. All of us. Tell me what you think. Why do we resist this fact? I want to hear your good voices now before I swing into one last thing. Why do we resist this? Did you want to say something, Rich?
If you wish.
Go ahead.
Well, I think it's part of humanity to consider yourself ahead of others, in particular people of different color, different religious beliefs, different values. I mean, look what our forefathers did to the Indians when they came to this country.
In fact, the Vatican had proclamations that it was a very Christian thing to eliminate people who weren't. And we've grown to understand that. Here comes one of the wise women.
Here come the notaries.
I've been hearing the word unity, especially from the Gospel of John and other places. And a very wise teacher that we've followed for years and years has reminded us, don't mix up unity with uniformity. You've used the word diversity in just the most beautiful way, because we are diverse and we still can be one. And the best example for me for learning is a husband and a wife or whatever partners, and you want them to think like you, and you want to make the decisions like I would make, and we've spent more than 50 years and we're still striving for the unity, because the uniformity ain't going to happen.
And we pay a terrible price when we try to do it. And we pay a terrible price when people who are not qualified make decisions about other people, like politicians making medical decisions. This is scary. Liz, did you want to say, did I see? No. Oh, I just handsome man.
The handsome man. What you said before, when you just got off your stool, talking about the off the throne. You talk about the unity and the church, and I think all of us, there's a lot of gray hair and a lot of no hair in this group here. You know, we've gone through a massive change in our church till today. And I think the basic goes back down to what have we been taught over all of these years? And to hear the things about a God who loves you unconditionally, that God is love, that we are made in God's image. And I've said many times before that I know God doesn't look like me, but my ability to love is my way of being able to be what we're called to do. And I think those are the messages from the earlier discussion, that the church needs to go into a direction. Those are the basis for Christianity. And as a church, we've probably created more laws and regulations than the Jews ever did, right? That we try to live up to, other than trying to say we are all in God's image, whether they're Muslims or gay or whatever you want to call it. We are all God's kids, and that's the basis for everything. And I think that's where we have to go back to.
Thank you, Jen. We're all God's. We are asked by our faith to love one another as you love yourself. That's the last part we forget. Yeah. I know you two have to get to a funeral, don't you? Are you okay? It's 11:30. Oh, 11:30, okay. Who else? Somebody else had their hand up. Nobody else? Does this offer you a slightly different image when, John, you're saying yes. Does it offer you a slightly different image when you think about the creche, John?
John, tell us. Tell us, John.
No, I just am reminded of a book I recently read, and it was about the West Point class of '02 going to war. And the war stories that they come back with are all different. And trying to make them and figure out which one is right and which one is wrong, which in reality they're all kind of correct, is very similar to the oral traditions of the gospel.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything?
I'm just thinking about is being shown as Anglo-Saxon, but Mary showed that it doesn't matter. Like in Guadalupe,
Yes.
she appears to that civilization
Right.
as one of them.
Yeah. And each culture has developed an understanding. In the one other thing, understanding of who she was, and gives her a name and a dress, like Lourdes in Guadalupe and so forth. One final thing that I wanted to, let me go back here, to talk about with you. Okay. I wanted to share that next week we're going to discuss Mary. And it seems to me to be rather appropriate. And as you mentioned, the way different cultures look at her. And I want to go back to Rich, what Rich said, but each one of us thinks in some way that we are superior. And I think some of that goes back to not only training and so forth, but I think we deal with what we call the scarcity image, that if I give too much to the other, there won't be enough for me. If I let too many into the country, that's going to affect my prosperity. And the other part of that, we need the labor. We need the labor coming in. And I do think the scarcity image plays a part. But if we could emphasize that God became one of us, happened to be Jewish, but he took on human nature, which says human nature is holy. I remember getting into a debate with a little priest when I was younger. I might not do it today, Mike. And we were talking about original sin. I maybe told you this one. And my theory of original sin is that we're born human. And we are not born a sinner. We're born human, and as we age, that humanity can make decisions, and sometimes we make bad ones. So we're baptized not to erase that black spot on a milk bottle, but we're baptized into a community that helps us as we grow to live the message we're supposed to live. That's my theory of original sin. So, okay, any other points you'd like to make? What do you think?
That's a pretty simple theory. Too bad we can't live with it.
Oh, you've got two mics. Oh, so you think you're that important. Okay, tell me what you just...
I just think that it's different for everybody, but you make it sound so simple. Why can't we get it?
Why can't we get it? We're born...
What else you got?
What else? There's my co-author. What else have you got? It is simple. We're born limited. And we're going to make mistakes. But Matthew Fox, whom you'd love, has written a book called Original Blessings. We are original blessings made in God's image, but we're human. And we're going to make mistakes.
One quote that I remember was that we are spiritual beings when we were born, and our job is to learn how to become human.
Oh my gosh, I hadn't heard that one before. Do you mind if I use it?
Write it down.
Write it before I forget it.
That's your next one.
That's my next one. Lectures. Are you spiritual or human? Both. Yeah, learning. All right. Well, we'll close today, and I thank you. Next week, we're going to take a look at Mary, and one of the authors who is absolutely wonderful is Elizabeth Johnson, and she's a sister of St. Joseph. Got in trouble with the Vatican for some of her writing, but all the theologians supported her. And she wrote a book called Friends and Prophets of God. And one chapter is devoted directly to Mary. So we'll take a look at that dear woman throughout the ages. Okay. Any other question? So when you walk past the creche, just give them a hello. And sometimes we act as the king and sometimes we act as the shepherd, so whatever. Thank you so much for coming. Okay. Say a prayer that Rob gets over this cold thing. Yeah. He's still down a bit. No, he doesn't have COVID. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I thought last week when he had the first penance, and then he came here, and then he had the concert coming up, 2 masses that night, and a funeral. Yeah. So I wish I could. I said to him, I wish I could.